Sheriff Roy Calder wanted the corner booth, and Daniel Marsh, a quiet widower halfway through his breakfast, told him no. Calder called it interference, dragged him out of the seat, and cuffed him in front of 40 customers, grinning like he had brought down a fugitive. Nobody in Millbrook Hollow said a word. What Calder did not know was that the man in his handcuffs had been confirmed as United States Marshals Service Director 9 days earlier and had driven to Millbrook Hollow to build a case against him. Then 2 black Suburbans and a state police cruiser rolled in. The rental truck crossed into Millbrook Hollow a little after 6:30 in the morning. A tan pickup with a cracked taillight lens and a rental barcode still stuck to the windshield. The man behind the wheel wore a flannel shirt, work pants, and a ball cap gone soft at the brim. He carried no badge, no sidearm, and no identification beyond a driver's license that would survive any check a rural deputy might run. His name was Daniel Marsh, and 9 days earlier he had been confirmed as director of the United States Marshals Service. Nobody in Washington had liked the plan. His chief of staff had argued that a man in his position did not drive himself into places like this, that there were district offices built for exactly this kind of work, that the exposure alone was reckless. Daniel heard all of it in a room with the door shut, then said that reports written by people who have never been on the wrong end of a badge tend to read very smoothly. They compromised on 2 conditions. He would check in every hour on the hour without fail, and a 2-marshal security element would wait at a highway rest area 28 miles down the interstate, close enough to move, far enough that nobody in Millbrook Hollow would notice government plates. Daniel accepted the escort the way a man accepts a thing he never plans to use. At 6:30 exactly, he pulled onto the gravel at the county line marker and made the first call. It lasted 8 seconds. He gave his position, said he was fine, and hung up. He was 41. He had been a widower for 5 years. Long enough that the word had stopped being news and become a plain fact, like his shoe size or the state he was raised in. It had also made him quiet in a way that worked for him. He no longer rushed to fill a pause. He let others fill it. And he had learned that most people, given enough quiet, will eventually show you exactly who they are. Millbrook Hollow had earned its way onto his list the ordinary way. Complaints, not 1 or 2, which every department collects, but a slow, patient pile stretching back almost 2 decades. Stops that produced no charges. Charges that disappeared before a hearing. Cash pulled from vehicles that never showed up on any evidence log. 5 separate letters from 5 separate residents describing 5 separate encounters in wording so alike that the analyst who flagged the file had written a single word in the margin. Pattern. Every one of those complaints ended at the same name. Sheriff Roy Calder had run the department for 21 years. And before that he had worn a deputy's star under a sheriff who had been his uncle. He was 63, thick through the chest, and he had never lost an election because no one had ever put a name on the ballot against him. In Millbrook Hollow, that counted as proof of something. The town itself was handsome in the way of towns quietly slipping under. A brick main street, a feed store surviving on lawn equipment, a savings and loan with its 1920s name still carved into the limestone above the entrance. Daniel drove its length twice, slow, like a man hunting a place to eat somewhere he has never been, and counted cruisers. 3, in 9 blocks, in a town of maybe 3,800 people. He parked in front of a diner with a hand-painted board advertising country ham and eggs for $7. The lot was already half full at 6:45. Mostly trucks, mostly older men. Through the glass he could see a counter with round stools, a run of booths under the window, and a waitress moving among them with a coffee pot held low against her hip, topping off cups before anyone asked. He slipped the phone into his shirt pocket, got out, and walked into a building where nobody had any cause to look at him twice. The bell over the door announced him. A few heads turned, marked a stranger, and turned back. The waitress glanced up from the register, and Daniel read her name off the tag on her apron. Peggy Dorn, early 50s, carrying the ease of somebody who has worked the same floor a very long time. She told him to sit anywhere, and he took the corner booth under the window, facing the door, out of a habit he had stopped noticing years earlier. The vinyl seat had been mended with tape that nearly matched. The window looked out on the lot, and across the road stood a squat gray building with the county seal on it that he had already picked out as the sheriff's office. Peggy came with the coffee before he asked. Daniel ordered eggs over easy, sausage, wheat toast, and told her he was in no rush. She wrote it without watching the pad, and something in the way she repeated it back suggested she had already decided he was passing through, which was exactly what he wanted her to decide. The room settled around him. 2 men in seed company caps argued over a bridge repair that had gone past deadline. A woman at the counter worked a word search in pen. Somebody's radio in the kitchen played a station that kept sliding out of tune. It was, in every way you could measure, an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, and Daniel Marsh ate the first half of his breakfast believing he might spend 3 quiet days here and leave with nothing but notes. At 7:10 the bell rang again and the room shifted. It was not sudden. The talk did not stop, but it dropped by a quarter. The way a radio drops when someone walks in front of it, and several people found reasons to study their plates. Daniel kept his eyes on his coffee and used the window glass, which gave him a clean reflection of the door. Sheriff Roy Calder came in first, hat in hand, and behind him 2 deputies. The older one, heavy-necked and comfortable, went straight to the counter and poured himself a mug without asking anyone. His name tape read Doyle. The younger one hung back by the door, hands at his belt, and looked at the floor more than the room. That one read Ray's. Daniel put him at 27, and noted that his body camera was the only one of the 3 switched on. Calder worked the room on his way through. He set a hand on a shoulder here, called a man by his first name there, asked after somebody's wife and waited for the answer. It was practiced, and it was genuinely friendly, and Daniel understood right away why 21 years of complaints had never turned into a single indictment. The man was not hated. He was well liked. That was the harder problem. Then Calder reached the middle of the floor and stopped, because there was a stranger sitting in the corner booth under the window. Peggy saw it before anybody. Daniel watched her grip tighten on the coffee pot, watched her take half a step toward his table, and then not take the second one. She turned instead toward the kitchen pass and stood there with her back to the room. And that told him more about Millbrook Hollow than the whole complaint file had. Doyle set his mug down on the counter. Reyes lifted his head. Calder crossed to the booth without hurrying and stood at the edge of the table, close enough that his belt buckle was at Daniel's eye level. He looked down with an expression that was nearly warm. "Morning," the sheriff said. "You're new." Daniel said good morning and agreed that he was. Calder nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. He rapped 2 fingers on the tabletop, twice, unhurried. Then he said that this particular booth was his, that it had been his every morning for a long time, that anybody in the room would tell him so, and that he would be obliged if the gentleman would move over to the counter. The room had gone quiet now. Somebody's fork touched a plate, and it sounded enormous. Daniel looked up at him and did not move. He said evenly that he had come in before 7, that the waitress had seated him, that his food had already come, and that he meant to finish it where he was. He said it without heat and without weight, like a man reciting a schedule. Calder's expression did not change, but his weight shifted. He said he wasn't sure the gentleman understood how things went in Millbrook Hollow. Daniel said he understood how things went in a restaurant. He said the table had not been reserved, that no sign said otherwise, and that every customer who walked through the door had the same claim on it. He added that if the sheriff wanted the seat tomorrow, he was welcome to come in earlier. Behind the counter, Peggy closed her eyes. Doyle laughed once, short and disbelieving, and then stopped when nobody joined him. Calder stood very still. In 21 years in that room, in front of these people, nobody had ever told him no out loud. It had simply never been necessary to test it. And Daniel, watching him carefully, understood that the sheriff was not angry yet. He was doing the arithmetic on what it would cost him to be refused in public, and finding the figure unacceptable. "Stand up," Calder said. Daniel asked, politely. "On what grounds?" That was the sentence that ended it, not the refusal, the question. Calder turned to the room first, which was the tell. "A man acting on the law does not check his audience," he announced, loud enough to reach the lot. That the gentleman had been asked twice to comply with a lawful order, and had twice refused. And that he had no way of knowing what a man like this was doing in his town, sitting where he could watch the department's front door. He said the word interference, and then he said it again, and the second time he said it, he had already made it true in his own mind. Daniel set his fork down flat on the plate and put both hands on the table where everyone could see them. He did not stand, but he did not resist either. He said clearly, so the whole room heard it, that he was not refusing to identify himself, that his wallet was in his right hip pocket, and that he was not armed. Every person in that diner would remember the sentence later, almost word for word. Calder told him to stand up and turn around. Daniel stood. He turned. He put his hands behind his back without being told to, which was a small piece of information he had not meant to give away. But he had stood on the other side of it 10,000 times, and his body was quicker than his judgment. The steel closed on his left wrist, then his right, and Calder ratcheted them a notch past necessary, the way a man does when he is making a point rather than securing a prisoner. Nobody in the diner moved. 40 people, and not one of them said a word. That was the part Daniel would keep, not the handcuffs. The silence. He stood facing the window with his own reflection in it and catalogued the room behind him. The two men in seed company caps studying their coffee. The woman at the counter with her pen frozen over the word search. Peggy at the register with both hands flat on it and her jaw set. Every one of them knew this was wrong. Every one of them had run the same math and landed on the same answer, which was that a stranger's bad morning was cheaper than 21 years of consequences. At the edge of his vision, one of the seed company caps had a phone up under the lip of the table, screen lit, held low. It stayed there maybe 20 seconds. Then the man glanced at Doyle and the phone went into his coat. And the man wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and kept them there. Deputy Reyes took one step forward. "Sheriff," he said. Calder did not look at him. He said the deputy could get the door. Reyes stood there while a clock somewhere behind the counter ticked twice. Daniel watched him in the glass and saw the exact moment the man decided he was not brave enough today, and saw also that the body camera was still running, its small light steady on his chest. Reyes went and got the door. Doyle took Daniel by the upper arm. Calder picked up the half-finished plate of eggs from the table, considered it, and set it down on the counter with a smile at Peggy that was not a smile at all. Then he sat down in the booth. He sat down in it, and he was still sitting there when they walked Daniel past him toward the door. At no point did Daniel Marsh say who he was. He could have ended it in 3 words. He knew he could have said his name and his title, and watched the color drain out of the sheriff's face right there between the register and the pie case, and the whole thing would have been over before his coffee cooled. Every instinct trained into him across 16 years told him to stop it now. That the director of the Marshals service in handcuffs in a rural diner was a disaster with a news cycle bolted to it. But he had come here for the letters. 5 residents, 5 encounters, the same language in all of them. And every one of those people had stood exactly where he was standing now, with no title to say out loud and no federal agency behind them. Reports written by people who have never been on the wrong end of a badge tend to read very smoothly. He had said that in a room in Washington, and everyone had nodded politely, and nobody had understood him. He understood himself now, so he let Doyle walk him out. He let the bell over the door ring for a 3rd time. He stepped from the warm smell of sausage into the cold flat light of the parking lot with his hands locked behind his back, and behind him the sheriff of Millbrook Hollow settled into the booth under the window and told Peggy Dorn, loud enough to carry through the glass, that he would take his usual. Across the road, the gray building with the county seal sat quiet in the morning sun. Above the door, on a bracket, a security camera pointed down at the road, and its red light was on. It was 7:52. Daniel Marsh's next scheduled check-in was in 8 minutes. The parking lot had an audience before the door finished closing. They came to the diner windows the way people come to a window when something is happening to somebody else. Close enough to see, far enough back that nobody outside could say for certain who was watching. 2 of the trucks had men standing beside them with cups in their hands. Across the street, a woman unlocking the tax office stopped with the key still in the door and did not turn it. Doyle walked Daniel to the second cruiser and turned him so his back was against the rear door. Then let go of his arm and stood there with his thumbs hooked in his belt, satisfied, like a man beside something he has finished building. Calder came out last. He put his hat on at the threshold, adjusted it once, and surveyed the lot with plain pleasure. Then he began to talk. He talked to nobody in particular, which meant he was talking to everybody. He said a man had been sitting where he could watch the department's front door for the better part of an hour. He said a man who refuses a lawful order in public is telling you something about himself. He said he had been doing this for 21 years, and that the day he stopped paying mind to strangers was the day this town got somebody hurt. Nobody contradicted him. That was the whole of it. Daniel stood with his shoulders against cold metal and counted 16 adults within earshot who had watched the entire thing from the moment the sheriff crossed the diner floor. The 2 men in seed company caps now at the window with their coffee, one of them with a phone in his coat pocket. The woman with the word search, Peggy Dorn, who had come as far as the doorway and stopped there with a towel in her hand, and who was the only person in Millbrook Hollow looking directly at him. None of them said a word. Not one. He was not angry with them, which surprised him a little. He had expected to be. But a stranger costs you nothing. And Roy Calder costs you everything for as long as you mean to keep living here. And 21 years is long enough to teach a whole town to run that math without noticing it is running. Deputy Reyes came out of the diner behind the sheriff and stopped by the front fender of the first cruiser. He had not touched Daniel once. He was young enough that the uniform still hung on him a little borrowed, and he kept glancing at the man in handcuffs and then away, and the small light on his chest camera was still burning steady. Doyle noticed it too. He told Reyes he was running his battery down over a table dispute. Reyes said the camera stayed on during a custody transport. He said it flatly, like a rule he had memorized. Because it was the only thing he had to stand on. Calder turned around at that. He looked at Reyes a moment, not unkindly, the way a man looks at a new hire who has spoken out of turn in front of a customer, and told him that when he had 21 years he could decide what needed recording. He said it warmly. Several people in the lot laughed. The light stayed on. Reyes did not switch it off, and he did not look at his sheriff again either, and Daniel filed that away with everything else. At 8 o'clock exactly, the phone in Daniel's shirt pocket began to ring. It buzzed against his chest, muffled, 6 times, and stopped. Doyle heard it, and grinned, and said the man's ride was calling. Calder did not react at all. He was busy telling a story about a wreck out on the state route 2 winters back, and the phone was simply part of the background of a morning that was going well for him. It rang a second time, 40 seconds later. Then a third. Nobody took it out of his pocket. Nobody searched him for it. Nobody asked whose it was. Daniel stood absolutely still against the cruiser and let it ring. And for the first time since the handcuffs closed, something in his face changed. Not to fear. To something much worse for Roy Calder, which was patience. 28 miles down the interstate. A 2 Marshal security element listened to a call go to voicemail 3 times, checked a location ping that had not moved from a diner parking lot in 11 minutes, and stopped waiting. They were rolling inside 90 seconds. The district office in the state capital put a second team behind them 9 minutes after that, and requested a state police unit off the highway. And by 8:20 the words director and no contact had moved far enough up the chain that a deputy director in Washington was standing at his desk, with a phone in each hand. Calder finished his story, opened the rear door of the cruiser, put a hand flat on the roof, and told Daniel to watch his head. They came from the west end of Main Street at 8:35, 3 vehicles moving fast and in formation, and the sound arrived before the sight did. 2 black Suburbans, new, identical, with plates that were not county plates, and a state police cruiser running behind them with its light bar lit. The lead Suburban came into the diner lot at an angle that boxed it. The second stopped nose out on the street. The state cruiser pulled across the mouth of the driveway and stayed there with its engine running. Doors opened at once. 7 people got out, and every one of them had credentials on a chain and a windbreaker with a star and lettering across the back. The lot went silent in the space of a breath. The men with the coffee cups set them down on the hoods of their trucks without seeming to know they were doing it. Doyle's hand went to his belt and stopped halfway. Reyes took 2 steps backward and put his hands out from his sides where they could be seen, palms open, which was the single most professionally correct thing anyone in a Millbrook Hollow uniform did that morning. A woman came around the front of the lead Suburban with her credentials already up, somewhere near 50, dark suit under the windbreaker. She did not look at the crowd or the vehicles or the diner. She scanned the lot in one pass, the way people are trained to. Deputy Marshal Renata Vasquez, she said. United States Marshals Service. I'm looking for Director Daniel Marsh. Roy Calder then did the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. He smiled. He stepped forward, pleased to be useful, pleased to be the man in charge on his own ground with federal officers asking him a question, and he pointed, with his whole hand, at the man in handcuffs standing against the rear door of his cruiser. That's your fella right there, Calder said. Picked him up about 45 minutes ago in the diner. Interference. If he's part of your business, he's all yours. But I'll tell you right now, he was sitting in there watching my building since before 7. Nobody moved. Vasquez looked at the man in the handcuffs. Something went across her face and was gone. And when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into a register that carried farther than shouting would have. Director, she said. Are you injured? Daniel said he was not. Behind her, a second marshal came forward with his credentials open, a heavy-set man with gray at the temples, whose name was Walt Coburn. And he did not address the sheriff at all. He addressed the lot. This is Daniel Marsh, Coburn said, holding the credentials up and turning slowly so that the diner windows, the men at the trucks, and every deputy present could see the photograph and the seal. Director of the United States Marshals Service, confirmed 9 days ago. He is here on federal authority. As of right now, this is a federal scene. The sound that went through the parking lot was not a gasp. It was smaller and much worse than that. It was 40 people understanding the same thing in the same second, and none of them willing to be the first to say it out loud. Peggy Dorn's hand came up over her mouth and stayed there. Roy Calder did not move. His arm was still half raised from pointing. The color went out of his face in stages, from the top down, and then he laughed once, a short ugly sound with no belief in it, and said that was not possible. Vasquez told him it was. Calder said the man had no identification. Daniel spoke then, for the first time since the diner door closed behind him, and he did not raise his voice. "I told you where my wallet was," he said, "in front of this entire town. You didn't look." The sheriff's mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. Doyle had gone the color of paper. He was looking at his own hand, the one that had been on the prisoner's arm, and he was looking at it the way a man looks at something he has just realized he cannot put down. Reyes's body camera light was still on. It had recorded all of it, from the moment the sheriff crossed the diner floor to the sentence Walt Coburn had just spoken, and every person standing in that lot would spend a long time being grateful that a young deputy had been too stubborn to switch it off. Vasquez put out her hand and told Calder to produce the key. He produced it. His fingers did not work correctly, and he dropped it once and had to pick it up off the asphalt, and there was no sound anywhere in the lot while he did. Then Daniel said something nobody expected. "Not yet." Vasquez stopped with the key in her hand. Daniel said evenly that the cuffs stayed on until the scene was documented. He wanted photographs from every angle. He wanted the position of every vehicle recorded. He wanted the name of every person present written down while they were still present, and he wanted all of it done with the restraints exactly where Sheriff Calder had put them. He said that a man in this town had been arrested that morning for finishing his breakfast, and that the only difference between him and the 5 people who had written letters to Washington was that this one had 3 vehicles coming. He said the record was going to show what it actually looked like. So it stayed on for 12 minutes. The director of the United States Marshals Service stood in a diner parking lot in handcuffs while marshals photographed him, and every person in Millbrook Hollow watched. And Roy Calder stood 6 feet away and was made to watch longer than anyone. Coburn worked the lot with a notebook. Vasquez worked the phone. The state cruiser never moved from the driveway. Then it came apart very fast. 2 marshals crossed the street to the gray building with the county seal and served paper on the desk clerk before she had finished standing up. The security camera above the door, the one with the red light that had been pointed at the road all morning, came off its bracket within the hour and went into an evidence bag. So did the camera over the diner's register, with Peggy Dorn's written consent, which she gave so quickly that she signed the form standing up against the pie case. At 9:15, from a terminal inside his own department, Roy Calder filed a supplemental narrative describing a subject who had become physically combative in the diner and had refused repeated requests to identify himself. 40 people had watched that not happen. He filed it while 7 federal marshals and a state trooper were standing in the parking lot outside his window. Server access was suspended at 9:40. Dispatch logs, arrest reports, evidence inventories, tow records, personnel files, 21 years of them went under federal seal before noon, and the supplemental narrative went under with the rest of it. Time-stamped, unamendable, 25 minutes old. Doyle was relieved of his body camera. It held 11 seconds of recording for the entire shift, which became a document all by itself. Reyes handed his over without being asked, unclipped it himself and stated the serial number out loud before he passed it across. Coburn looked at the steady light on the front of it, then looked at the deputy, and wrote something down. One of the men in a seed company cap, a lawn equipment customer named Earl Pruitt, waited until the lot had thinned, and then came to Coburn with his phone held out in both hands. 22 seconds of video. The sheriff crossing the floor, the word interference. He said he had put it in his pocket because Doyle had looked at him, and that he had been sitting in his truck for an hour trying to decide whether to come over. Coburn took the phone and told him he was the first person in that building to move. And then the thing nobody had planned began. People started coming across the street. The first was Harlan Webb, 53, who ran the parts counter at the feed store and who had written one of the 5 letters. He walked up to Coburn with his hands shaking and said he had been arrested in 2020 for an expired tag, held 18 hours, released with no charge, and had never gotten the toolbox back out of his truck bed. After Webb there was a woman who had been pulled over 6 times in a single month. After her, a man who had been told on a dark road with no camera running exactly what would happen to his contractor's license if he kept talking to the county about his son. By noon there were 10 of them standing in the lot. By 2, Vasquez had stopped taking statements outside and opened a room in the town hall because the line was visible from Main Street. 21 years of quiet arithmetic. And the whole town was doing the math out loud at once. The records did not require interpretation, which is the particular tragedy of men like Roy Calder. They believe the danger is in what people say. It is almost always in what they wrote down. 16 arrest reports carried timestamps altered after filing, 7 of them by more than 4 hours. 3 evidence inventories listed cash amounts in one entry and different amounts in the disposition column. 12 arrests across 8 years had no charging document of any kind, including one man held 43 hours. And in each of those cases, no prosecutor had ever been notified that an arrest had occurred at all. Marlene Suggs, the county prosecutor, had a separate problem. Her office had declined to act on 10 excessive force complaints against the department over 7 years, 8 of them without opening a file. Calder made his calls from the sidewalk with the phone against his ear and his hat in his other hand, and the lot watched him make them. He called Mayor Frank Tillery, who listened for 90 seconds, and then said he would have to be advised by counsel, and ended the call. He called Suggs, who told him she was recusing herself and that he should not call her again. He stood there with the phone still in his hand after the second call, and he did not dial a third number, because there wasn't one. By early afternoon there were 2 television vans at the west end of Main Street and a third coming. The Marshals Service press office released one statement of 4 sentences and answered nothing else. Daniel Marsh declined comment on the record, and would keep declining for 19 days. At 3:15, in front of the department he had run for 21 years, Vernon Doss, chairman of the County Board of Supervisors, served Roy Calder with an emergency order of suspension issued out of the state attorney general's office that morning. Doss's hands were not steady either. He read it aloud because the order said to read it aloud. Calder surrendered his service weapon and his commission card to Doss. He unpinned the badge himself and set it on the hood of his own cruiser. The sound it made on the metal was very small. Then Coburn told him he was a subject of a federal civil rights investigation conducted jointly with the Department of Justice, and advised him of his rights out loud on the sidewalk. And the men from the pickup trucks were still there to hear it. 21 years, and it had taken one day. And the strangest part was that nothing in the file had ever been hidden. It had been sitting in that gray building the entire time, waiting for a morning when the man he chose was the wrong one. The town did not celebrate. That was the thing nobody in Washington would understand, later, reading the summary. There was no applause on Main Street when the badge came off the hood of the cruiser and went into an evidence bag. There was no crowd. By 4, the lot outside the diner had emptied. The pickups had gone, and Millbrook Hollow had turned very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, because Roy Calder was not the only person exposed that morning. 40 people had watched a man be handcuffed for finishing his breakfast, and 40 people had decided in the same second that it was not worth the cost. They had gone back to their coffee. They had watched from the windows with their cups in their hands. And now they were sitting in their kitchens with a different answer in front of them, which was that the thing they had been calling common sense for 21 years had another name. Peggy Dorn closed the diner at 2 in the afternoon, 4 hours early, turned the sign around, and sat in the corner booth under the window with the lights off for a long time. She told Daniel about it later, in a statement, and that was how he learned it. Harlan Webb went back to the parts counter and did not sell anything for the rest of the day. 3 separate people came in and asked him what he had said to the federal marshal in the parking lot. He told them. All 3 went and got in the line at the town hall. The room they gave Daniel in that building had a folding table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out on the back of the savings and loan. He worked out of it until nearly 9 that night. And at some point in the evening Renata Vasquez came in, set a paper cup of coffee down in front of him, and said the thing that had been sitting in her since 8:35 that morning. She said he could have ended it in 4 seconds. She said she had watched the register footage twice, and there were at least 3 moments where one sentence from him would have stopped the whole thing before the cuffs came out, and she wanted to know why he had not said it. Daniel turned the cup a half turn on the table and did not touch the coffee. He said that when he took the job, 5 letters from this county had crossed his desk in the same month, all describing the same experience in almost identical language. He said he had read them in a room where everybody agreed the situation was serious, and nobody present had ever been on the other end of it. I wanted to know what it actually feels like, he said. To be a person a room decides isn't worth the trouble. Not to read it. Not to have it briefed to me. To be the man against the car with no name to say out loud, no badge, and nobody coming. Vasquez said that by 8:35 he had 3 vehicles coming. They didn't, Daniel said. Harlan Webb didn't. That's the entire point. He sat 18 hours in that same building over an expired tag, and nobody in this town came for him either. The only difference between him and me this morning is that my phone was already ringing. He said that if he had identified himself in the diner, the department would have produced a clean report by noon and a sincere apology by dinner, and every one of those 21 years would have stayed exactly where it was. He said the arrest was the only evidence that could not be argued with, and that he had let it happen because he was the first person in Millbrook Hollow in 2 decades who could afford to. Vasquez turned that over for a while. Then she asked whether he intended to speak to Calder. He said he did. and that he would do it in front of the man's lawyer, on his way out of the building, with nothing in his hands and nothing to ask him. He said he was a witness in this case and a victim in it, and that he was not going to hand any defense attorney in the country a reason to throw the whole thing out. It happened 2 days later, on the front steps of the gray building with the county seal, at 4 in the afternoon. Calder came out with an attorney a half step behind him. He was in a windbreaker and an untucked shirt, and without the uniform, he looked like exactly what he was, which was a heavy-set man of 63 who had run out of phone numbers. He stopped when he saw who was standing at the bottom of the steps. Daniel told the attorney plainly that he was asking no questions, that his own marshals were 10 feet away, and that the man was free to stop him at any word. The attorney looked at both of them and said nothing, which was permission enough. Calder spoke first. He said he had kept this town safe for 21 years. He said there had not been a killing in Millbrook Hollow since 2012, that he had pulled 2 kids out of a flooded creek off the county road with his own hands, that half the people standing in that line at the town hall had called him at home on a Sunday at least once. He said all of it flatly, like a man reading his own resume to a wall. Daniel told him that every word of that was true, that it was in the file, and that it would go to the prosecutors along with everything else. Then Calder said the thing he had clearly been building for 2 days. He said none of this would have happened if a stranger had not sat down in his booth. He said that if the man had just moved to the counter, none of it. And he did not finish the sentence because he heard it. No, Daniel said. He said that people always believe the collapse started on the day somebody finally caught them, and that it never does. He said 16 reports had been altered before he ever crossed the county line. That 12 people had been held with no charging document across 8 years. That Harlan Webb's toolbox had gone out of a truck bed in 2020, and had never appeared on any inventory anywhere in that building. None of that had anything to do with a booth, Daniel said. You didn't fall this morning because you arrested the director of the Marshals service. You'd have fallen the same way if I'd been nobody. You'd just have fallen slower, and it would have cost more people on the way down. You stopped being able to tell the difference between the law and your own pride. And once a man can't tell those apart, the badge is only a delay. Calder looked at the railing under his hand. He said very quietly that he had never thought of himself as a corrupt man. Daniel said he believed that, and that it was the reason the file was 21 years long. Daniel flew back to Washington on the 3rd day, because the director of the service cannot run a field investigation and should not try. Vasquez stayed. The case was formally consolidated within the week. The Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice took it jointly with the Marshals Service, which is the only way a case like this can be built, and the charging documents came down in the 2nd week. Deprivation of rights under color of law across multiple counts, falsification of records and conspiracy involving 2 other members of the department. Elton Doyle was named in 3 counts. He resigned by letter the day before he was served, which changed neither the indictment nor his exposure to it. Marlene Suggs's office was placed under separate review for the declined complaints, and she stopped returning calls from anyone in Millbrook Hollow. Frank Tillery did not resign. He stood up at the town council meeting the following Tuesday, in a hall with 340 people in it and folding chairs down the side aisles, and said that he had eaten breakfast 1 booth from that window for 8 years, and had never once asked a question, and that he was not going to stand there now and pretend to be surprised. It was not much of a speech. It was the first honest one anybody had heard in that building in a long time, and the room let him finish it. The county appointed an acting sheriff 11 days after the arrest. They gave it to Marcus Reyes, who had 3 years on the department, and who had been the only person in a Millbrook Hollow uniform that morning with a camera running. That recording had become the spine of the entire case. It carried the sheriff crossing the diner floor, the refusal, the word interference spoken twice, the cuffs, and 12 minutes of a parking lot in which 40 people said nothing at all. Reyes did not want the job. He said so out loud to the council, on the record. He told them he had stood in that lot and taken 1 step forward and then gone and gotten the door instead, and that a man who had done that should not be handed a department. Walt Coburn asked to sit in on the appointment, and said the only thing he said all evening. He said that across the 21 years, Roy Calder ran that building. Marcus Reyes was the only person in it who had ever left a light on. The reforms were neither dramatic nor fast. Body cameras went to continuous recording on every contact, uploading to a county server that nobody inside the department could reach. Arrest reports locked at filing, with amendments visible as amendments. Every custodial hold went to the prosecutor within 6 hours or the person walked. An outside review board was seated with 5 residents on it, and Harlan Webb was one of the 5, which nobody in the room found funny and everybody found appropriate. None of it was new. All of it had existed on paper somewhere in that building already. It had simply never been enforced by anyone who could be told no. What actually changed in Millbrook Hollow was smaller and harder to write into a policy. People started talking. The line at the town hall ran for 10 days. By the end, there were 68 statements on the record, and 49 of them concerned incidents more than 3 years old, which meant that for years the people in that town had been carrying the same story, and each one had believed he was the only one holding it. A woman described 6 traffic stops in a single month. A man described a conversation on a dark road about a contractor's license. 2 of the 5 original letter writers came in and asked whether their letters had ever been read at all, and were told that they were the reason any of this had happened. Peggy Dorn gave the statement that ran 9 pages. Most of it was about mornings. Daniel Marsh came back to Millbrook Hollow on a Thursday 19 days after the morning he arrived. He came to the diner just before 7, at the same hour, in the same rental pickup with the cracked taillight, wearing the same flannel shirt. He had not put on a suit for it. Vasquez had suggested a suit and he had said no, and she understood why before he finished saying it. The television vans were gone from the west end of Main Street. They had been gone for 11 days, which was about as long as anything holds. The lot was 2/3 full. The bell over the door rang. The room stopped. It wasn't the same stopping as the first morning. On the first morning a stranger had walked in and nobody had looked at him twice. This time every head in the building came up at once. And for a moment nothing happened at all. Then Earl Prout, in a seed company cap at the counter, the man who had held a phone under the lip of a table for 22 seconds, and then put it in his pocket, set both palms flat and stood up. The woman with the word search stood next. Then the 2 men in the corner booth. Then the rest, in ones and twos, until nobody in the diner was sitting down. Not one of them said his title. Nobody said director. They stood the way people stand when they cannot think of anything to say. And standing is the only thing left that means something, and Daniel understood exactly what it was, because it was not for the office he held. It was for 12 minutes in a parking lot. He nodded to the room once and went and sat in the corner booth under the window. Peggy Dorn brought the coffee before he asked, the same as the first time, and her hand was not steady. She did not take out the pad. She said, "Eggs over easy, sausage, wheat toast," and asked whether that was still right. Daniel said it was. She stayed at the edge of the table with the pot in her hand, and told him she had been standing 4 feet from that booth holding this same coffee pot, and had not put it down, and that she thought about it every morning now. He told her she had signed a consent form standing up against her own pie case before the marshals finished asking, that the register footage was in the case file, and that she had done more that day than anyone else in the building. Peggy went back to the kitchen and did not come out for a while. He ate the whole breakfast this time. Through the window he could see the gray building across the street, where the camera on the bracket had been replaced with a newer one, and where an acting sheriff who had not wanted the job was working a desk. At 10 minutes to 8, Marcus Reyes came out the front door, saw the pickup in the lot, and looked across at the window. Daniel raised 2 fingers off the tabletop. Reyes nodded and went to his vehicle. Daniel paid at the register. He left the tip in cash under the edge of the plate as he always did, and he made no speech, and nobody asked him for one. The bell rang a last time behind him. Vasquez was waiting by the lead Suburban with the door already open. She asked where he wanted to go next, and he gave her the name of a county in another state with 4 letters in the file and a department nobody had ever audited. She said the deputy director was going to have a stroke. He said the deputy director could have the seat by the window. The rental pickup went out the west end of Main Street a little after 8 in the morning, and Millbrook Hollow went back to work, and the diner filled up, and the corner booth under the window sat empty until somebody who had come in just before 7 decided to sit in it. Power does not make a man great. What reveals him is how he treats the people who appear to have none. The stranger with no title to say out loud. The man against the car with nobody coming for him. Roy Calder did not fall because he put handcuffs on the wrong person. He fell because for 21 years he had been setting his own pride where the law was supposed to be, and a town had agreed to call that safety. When prejudice replaces the law and silence covers the difference, justice does not collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, in booths and parking lots, one small refusal to speak at a time. And it takes almost nothing to turn back. One deputy who would not switch off a camera. One customer who finally handed over his phone. One waitress who signed a form standing up. One man who stayed in his seat and finished his breakfast.